Well, welcome back. My name is Stephenie Foster, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. And I'm going to start by saying this is a panel about measuring progress, where we are, from where we've come, and where we want to go. So I also want to say we all want to live in a world that's prosperous. We all want to live in a world that's secure. And unless we involve women across the board in the economy, in politics, in education, in health, and in the community, we won't be able to do that. And so one of the most important things we can do to understand where we need to go is to understand where we are today. As we see from the people who've spoken already today, there's a tremendous amount of talent out there. There are a lot of women with great ideas who have a lot of entrepreneurial, innovative thoughts, skills, vision, and who need to be part of any conversation as we move forward in this world. If we don't do that, as a community globally, we're cutting ourselves off from a large amount of the talent that we need to really solve the challenges that we have today. And so that's what we're going to talk about today on this panel. We are going to look at where we are, where we want to go. I do want to start by saying you heard a little bit earlier on the panel this morning about the fact that progress has stalled for women across the board in both politics and in the economy most particularly. I do also want to say, because it was alluded to earlier, we know in each of those sectors and in every sector that when women participate, progress goes more quickly, we jumpstart it, and that we really see a much broader and inclusive way of dealing with problems. And so that's the backdrop for what we're here to talk about today. The numbers are pretty stark when it comes to political participation. As you heard about economic participation, based on what the Global Women's Economic Forum Gender Gap Report said that just came out, is that we are now at a point where it will take 217 years for there to be parity between men and women in the economic sphere. In politics, it's actually even more grim, I should say. And so we have about 22 heads of state that are women, 23% of parliamentarians worldwide are women. We do know, though, that when women are in those positions in public life, they tend to bring different issues to the public debate. They tend to have different perspectives on issues because we all live different lives. And not every woman lives the same life. Not every person does. So the more diverse and inclusive these populations are who help make decisions, the more broad-based those policy solutions will be. We know that when women are engaged in peace talks, peace agreements are 64% less likely to fail and 35% more likely to last 15 years. And if you've ever lived in a conflict country, that's a really important statistic. So we are going to, again, look at these questions. We are joined by three really amazing panelists, and I will introduce them very briefly. Their bios are, two of their bios are in your program, one is not, so I will spend a little more time on our third panelist. Our first panelist is Gwen Young, who I've known for several years. She's director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., also the Women in Public Service Project, which was a program that was formed out of the State Department when Secretary Clinton was secretary, and I actually worked at the department then. Our second panelist is from UVA, so many of you may know her. It's Associate Professor of Politics, Women, Gender, and Sexuality, Denise Walsh. Our third speaker was gracious enough to join us when a speaker couldn't get here, so our third speaker is Catherine Constantinides from South Africa. She is an Archbishop Tutu Africa Oxford Fellow. She's a climate activist, an entrepreneur, and engaged in social justice issues in Africa. She has been just named one of the 100 most influential young leaders in Africa and one of South Africa's 21 icons. So thank you for joining us and really for your graciousness in coming. So with that, I'm going to start with one question to all the panelists that I'd really like you to focus on. We've spent a lot of time talking about, in this morning and for the rest of the conversation, about women, the need for there to be more women in leadership, the need for us to really showcase the women who are there. But I'm curious, and I'll start with you, Gwen, and then ask all of you, what are the goals of this work really fundamentally? Is it to get more women? Is it to change policy? Is it both? How do you see us balancing those goals? Because sometimes you can have women in office who may not be, and that's fine, and it may not be in their ideology to promote what we would consider sort of feminist goals or feminist foreign policy. How do you balance what the goals are of this kind of work to increase women's participation?
Thank you, Stephenie, and thank you all. Happy to be here. I think in terms of women in policy and political leadership, focus on this panel, I think the goal is definitely more women, but with the overall goal is better governance, an inclusive society that has policies and services that look like what a country or a community experiences. And I'm hearkening back to the previous panel about talking about, we don't know what women's leadership is until you get 50% or more at the table. So it is about having more women at the table, but it's a more inclusive government, it's better policies, and it's better systems that are actually working to be inclusive of everybody and not just women and not just the typical power structure across the table. So we have a target, and I'll end on that is 50% of women's leadership in governments across the globe by 2050. So we have a target. We're going to talk about measuring progress. And part of it is we need to get women and a variety of women at the table to see what the community looks like, to see what good governance looks like, and to get a variety of perspectives in the policy world and in the political world.
Great. Thanks, Stephenie. Thank you all for being here, not only to hear what we have to say and engage in this conversation, but to help those of us who are actually, this is our home, UVA is our home, put women and women's leadership on the agenda as an institution. There are some of us in this room, I see Catherine over there, who've been working on this issue for a long time, and so you're helping us, and I really appreciate your being here. In terms of women in politics, what I'd like to talk about a little bit is the research on women in politics, which is what I work on. So there's several reasons why we might want to have women's participation in formal politics as well as women's participation in civil society more broadly. And one reason, of course, is just a basic matter of justice, right? So we see lots of men occupying all of these positions of power. Why not women too? But there are some instrumental reasons why we might want to have women in politics. And those instrumental reasons have actually been at the forefront. And one of them is the one that Stephenie has mentioned in terms of public policy. But there's others as well. So we know when we see more women in leadership positions in politics, that more women in society are inspired to engage in politics, to be interested in it, to perhaps vote, to go out and knock on doors and try to convince people to become candidates or to advocate for their own candidates. So we do know that that symbolic effect is important. Even more, though, I think most of us are really interested in seeing more women in politics because we hope that it will change public policy, that somehow it will advance women's rights. And what we know from the literature is that that actually isn't the case. And it's not because women aren't good politicians. It's because institutions and structures really do shape what women are able to do once they get into positions of power. And I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit more later.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I agree with both of my fellow panelists and what they've already said. So not to reiterate what they have said, but just to add to that, I think that a fundamental goal for us as an organization, the work that I do specifically in South Africa and across the continent, is really to drive systematic change from behavior. How are we talking about gender issues in the home? This was briefly mentioned a little bit earlier, but it's critically important. How are we changing the value set? What does that value set look like within our societies, within our countries and our continent? And what does that global conversation then look like? It is really important, both from a policy perspective and from a political perspective, to have more women represented, absolutely. But we really need to understand that women are the center of our communities. I come from a continent where women they hold the home together. They are the ones that push community building, community social justice. They are the ones that are at the forefront of so much that is happening at a grassroots level. And therefore, it is so important that women are a part of the conversation. However, inclusivity is crucially important. I may be crucified for saying this, but even though this is a discussion on women and women empowerment, I'm a huge supporter of the boy child. And I do believe that part of these conversations need to make sure that we are addressing the inclusion of the boy child as an important part of our global development, because coming from South Africa and coming from Africa, we cannot leave the boy child behind. And we will see a huge problem in 50 years' time, and we'll have a set of men sitting up here having the same discussion, but in the reverse. So we need to make sure that we're taking the boy child with us, and inclusivity has to be the ultimate goal. We need to get to a point where we're not discussing gender equality, because gender equality is a way that we live. It is part of our value set as a society and as communities, and within policy frameworks. It is not something that needs to be discussed. Our goal has to be that it is part of the framework we're working within.
And I think the issue of data helping us understand where we are and then where we want to go, if our goal is that there's equity or equality between men and women and boys and girls, is very important. So I want to turn to you, Gwen, and ask you, and I think that if either of you would like to comment, I think you obviously work at the Wilson Center, and there's a big project you have on collecting data around women and public life, participation in public life. So maybe talk a little bit about that, but also why did you feel at the Wilson Center that that was an important thing to do? There's a lot of data out there. And how did you pick this particular sort of index to put together? What gap were you filling, and what do you hope to use it for?
Thank you, Stephenie. So we just launched at the Wilson Center, in order to get to our goal of 50 by 50, for 50 countries at the moment, measuring where women are in political and public office. So where are they in civil service, national security, judiciary, the executive and the legislative branch, okay? Not just where are they in parliament or where are they in politics and elected office, but where are they across the government? What are the leadership positions, right? Where do you want them to be? So one stat we know, for example, is women make up 44% of civil services globally. They make up 29% of the leadership. So there's our kind of model. And we're also looking at how they got there. What does their economic empowerment look like? What is sexual harassment? What are protection laws? What are quota systems? What type of governance are they under? And finally, how much power they hold, right? So how much power, budget power, veto power? Go into your thing. What's the perception? Do people view women as having the right to hold public office? So to come back to what Stephenie's talking about, why did we choose this index? We chose it as a framework, right? We live in an area, everyone talks about big data. I think when I went to university, there was not as much emphasis on stats and data as there is now. But one thing we know, it provides a framework where you can start to look at what are the levers to push for opportunities? What's the intersection between your access to public life and how much power you're going to hold? But also, data can drive solutions and change. You can drive innovative ways. And so one thing when we looked at this project is I said, let's put the assumption there's plenty of qualified women out there on the side. What do we need to do to drive systemic institutional change and behavior change? What can we change system-wise? What can we change policy-wise? And how can they interact? And how can we adapt it on a country-by-country basis? And so I will end, it sounds a bit like a marketing. Our index is not ranking countries. So this isn't the best country and you're the worst country, right? People will use it for that, clearly. But it's to look at how a country progresses over time, and it's to look at these intersections between your pathway, your position, and how much power you hold to actually figure out what is holding women back. You know, is it just a family leave policy, or is there more? Is it unconscious bias? Is it how much, what economic level you come from? And so I think having this data framework as a start, as a framework, as an online platform, to be able to shift the things around to figure out what policies and system change you can make is incredibly important.
And what challenges did you face? We don't have hours, so
where shall I begin? Exactly.
I'm assuming you did. And in terms of the data, how did you? I'm assuming some countries were better than others. Maybe just a little bit about that, because given we have a global audience, I think that's a really important point.
So we ended up with 50 countries for the first iteration of the index, based on countries that had enough data to actually run a regression and run some numbers, right? So that was the 35 OECD countries, to be frank, and 15 additional countries that we based on population, how much data they have, and tried to get a geographical representation. One of the biggest challenges is the data gaps. And it's not just, the countries in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia. If you call up the national court system in the United States and ask if they disaggregate judges by sex, they do not. on a consistent and systemic basis, right? So certain states do, certain courts do, but not across. So there's huge data gaps. There's huge data gaps in national security based on things like confidentiality. You know, you can't have a peace negotiation while you're in peace negotiations necessarily mention everybody that's around the table. But there was an index just released 2 weeks ago about women in peace negotiations since 1990. But I would say data gaps are the biggest challenge. And the second challenge is that we're overcoming is countries that don't want this data transparent. And so one of the notions is that if we have this data and we put it out there and we have this index, is that hopefully that will encourage governments to be more transparent about who's in government, about what they do, about their progress, and that they can come out and say, this is who we are. This is what we look like as a society. So we're really going towards like transparency and open governance in a roundabout way, not to say that I and the Wilson Center and my 3-person team can do it all, but just, I think the challenges are the data gaps and then people's willingness to sort of make that data transparent so that we can start the analysis and the conversation.
Right. I mean, it's hard to say. People can easily say there's no pipeline if there's no statistics about how many women are coming up through these various job categories that would qualify them to take the leap to the next job.
Or you can say we have a female president and we're fine. Or you can say to push back against Rwanda, frankly, is we have enough women in parliament, so the rest of the government's fine, or the rest of the society is fine, right? So there's a little bit of just sort of, you know, what do the numbers look like to give us a sense of what it all looks like together to be able to make some conversations, discussions, and policy change.
And Denise, going to you, because you really are, you know, doing a lot of research into this and sort of, you mentioned that obviously, but if you could talk to us about, in the research you've done, which I know you did in part for USAID and the US government, talking about what you saw as the barriers to women's participation and how you kind of sorted that out and made sense of I mean, there are tremendous barriers that we all know about, violence and, you know, in some countries, lack of quota systems, and political parties are not the most welcoming of women, just as a point here. But how do you sort that out in a sort of a systemic way?
Right. So one of the things that we know is it's pretty easy to track individual behaviors that are really making it difficult for women to engage in participation, right? So women will report back either to reporters, journalists, or even to academics some of the things that some of their male colleagues do once they are actually in a particular office, right? And we've actually seen a lot of this in the news lately, mansplaining, for instance, right? So there's a lot of individual behaviors that end up marginalizing women in their everyday interactions with colleagues. And then there's also various types of threats that women also experience either when they're trying to get into politics or engaged in civil society, right, or formal politics. And those threats can be a variety of types, right? So we've seen threats of, individual men wanting to throw women out of their homes, for instance, to threat to ostracizing them from the community, threats to burning down their houses, threats to their reputation. And we also see, and not very often, but we still see it, is violence against women in politics. And there's a new group of people who are in politics and gender who are working on these issues right now, trying to understand the kind of violence that women experience. It's very difficult to tell whether they're experiencing that violence because they're in the opposition party, for instance, because they're women, right? Is it just that it's gendered violence and men experience a different type of politics or a different type of violence? Or are they experiencing that violence because they are specifically women in politics, right? So there's a number of things that we're just beginning to try to understand in terms of opposition, because frankly, over the past 20 years or so, what we've seen is this huge uptick, right, in women's participation in legislatures. So a lot of scholars have been so thrilled to see that we've been counting the numbers, right, trying to figure out how to get more women in, how to get quotas passed, how to get quotas implemented. And what we're now stepping back and seeing is a lot of these women face significant barriers at the individual level and then within institutions. So we know, for instance, the political parties tend to be very hostile to women. They're deeply hierarchical, right? And this is not a battle about ideology. So the data is really helpful for feminists, right? It's really helpful for women's organizations because they know where the problems are, they can identify them then, and they can begin to attack and challenge those problems. But the data, at least in my experience and in my research, rarely convinces opponents, right? And that's because this is about political power. This is a battle for who is going to control the legislature, the political party, groups on the ground, the media. I mean, all of these institutions are places that are really significant in terms of shaping public opinion and public policy. And certain men, not all men, but certain men dominate those industries. And they're not going to just open the doors and let women walk in. And the women that they do let walk in are going to be women who they've trained, who are party lackeys, who are loyal to them. So you get those women into those positions of power, and you don't change the institutions, you don't transform the policies, so we don't see the kinds of feminist changes that many of us in this room, I think, are hoping for and looking for.
So Catherine, hearing both Gwen and Denise, who've worked on these issues, gathering data, doing research, how does this resonate with your experience on the ground? Working in South Africa, I know you work with a lot of community groups and people across the spectrum of sort of what they do in the country. So what's your perspective on what you've just heard?
I think the points made are really crucial. On the ground back at home, I'd like to share an example. We talk about policy and the importance for women in politics. Currently, we have a new ministry within our parliamentary portfolio, and we have a Minister of Women. And within that ministry, this woman specifically deals with, or this ministry specifically deals with women issues. Issues that in the last 20 to nearly 25 years of our young democracy have never been addressed. This is an opportunity for a woman who understands these issues and is emotionally attached to these issues very differently to be able to drive policy, judicial change, making sure that there are certain legal processes for sexual abuse, harassment, etc. Things that have never been addressed with male-dominated ministers where these issues sat under him. So we see great examples. We have 40.5% of our parliamentarians being women, which is relatively progressive. It is important to ensure that we push that number or hold that number at least where it's at. We see countries like Rwanda who have taken the lead and really have amazing women in leadership roles who are doing a great amount of work. In communities across our country, we see women taking the lead and really driving home issues of importance, really spearheading so much of the grassroots level research, work being done. And I work in North Africa as well in a refugee camp. And in that refugee camp, it is a refugee camp of the Sahrawi people. That entire refugee camp is spearheaded by women. The strength of that camp relies on these women. Now, you also have other things at play, being culture, religion. This is a Muslim nation, yet the women spearhead the activity within those camps, holding that camp together and ensuring that everything that needs to happen is driven by women. So it's an amazing thing to see in a community that is culturally and religiously should be male-dominated. Women have taken the lead. Unfortunately, they have been there for 42 years, but women continue to strive to be leaders within that space. The other thing in South Africa, which is really an unfortunate thing, you mentioned quotas. What we have seen, and as a young country, and many of our countries across the continent, I mentioned Rwanda, but in South Africa, what we have seen is the quota system being put in, and women doing the greatest disservice to us, because women are then put into positions of power only because they're women and we get to tick a box. And I really believe that we have to make sure that we drive this agenda and make sure that we're getting more women into politics, more women into places of power and position of leadership. But it has to be because they deserve to be there. It has to be because they are good enough for that job. Because if they're not, and they fail at their basic duties in that position, they give us all a bad name. And we have seen this happen, where we have ministers who are ministers of portfolios that they're not suited for that job, they shouldn't be there, but because they know someone, they're politically connected, they're given an opportunity to be a minister. And what do we say? Oh, well, we have a woman minister. This for us is a huge challenge, because what happens? She is pointed out as that female minister that couldn't do her job. She's that woman minister that failed on the social grants. all of these kinds of things. And this is part of them, the social discussion that is had. And it does the biggest disservice for these kinds of conversations. It does the biggest disservice for us to move the gender equality discussion forward. So I really believe that we need to also, as feminists and as activists on this topic, we need to also push this discussion forward, saying that we should be moving forward to be the best person for the job. I don't want to be the CEO of a company and be the female CEO of that company. I don't want to get the job because I'm a female. I want to get that job because I'm the best fitted person for that role. And that goes across all spectrums, be it in civil society. You could be the leader of a community church group. You must be the leader of that community church group because you're the best person for that job. Many of the great attributes that were discussed by Mr. Going from Tupperware earlier mentioned the kinds of things that we don't always measure. Because how do you measure empathy and attributes like that? How do you actually put a measurement to them? Yet, in communities on the ground, we see these attributes every single day by the women leaders who are not given titles and positions. They're the women leaders who are moving our communities forward, and they are the ones that give us hope. There are pockets of hope of unbelievable people across our society, women, who are driving all sorts of things, who are making changes, who are impacting development across the continent, yet they don't have leadership titles, they don't have positions, but they are at the forefront of change.
And there always are people like that. So I think that's in how we recognize them is so important. But I would say there's a disagreement probably. I'd be curious on this panel, and I know generally, I mean, there are people who would support quotas in terms of, quotas are considered to be, in the words of the Beijing platform, temporary special measures to give underrepresented groups, in this case women, access to seats of decision making. So most of them are in parliaments. We don't have one in the United States, which is not something I think we would probably ever have, but a lot of countries have them. And in fact, many countries that have more than 30% women in parliament do have quotas. So again, and I take your point because it goes both ways, but I'm curious about Denise and then Gwen, if you have thoughts about quotas, because I know this is a very hotly contested issue in this space.
Yeah, and I think your points are really important because what they're really pointing to is this backlash, I think would say, against quotas. And this is one of the stories. Oh, that these women aren't qualified. So first of all, we all know there are plenty of unqualified men in public office. Right. So, I mean, as a point of justice, one would expect to see as many unqualified women as unqualified men if there was no such thing as gender inequality. That doesn't help with the kinds of issues that you're dealing with on the continent. I completely understand that. Another thing that I think is really important to know is that there's a ton of research out there on quotas because there's numbers that people can count, and it was exciting to see so many women move into politics. So what we know is overall from the global research on quotas is, first of all, when they're implemented, they work. And by what I mean by what they work is the fact that we actually do see women's numbers rising in these particular institutions, right? And we also know that the women who get into these positions tend to be more qualified than men. And that really isn't surprising at all. I mean, we're talking here about gender inequality. We're not talking here about special interests for women. We're talking about addressing the special interests that men have. And how can we break down those barriers to get women into these positions? So we often see women who are more qualified. However, they're also working in institutions that are highly masculinist, right? They reward the players in the system who play by the rules of the game and try to be like honorary men. And this is never going to work for women. There's always going to be limits. There's tons of research on this in terms of the psychology literature, but all I have to do is point out to you the stories that were around Hillary Clinton, right? The more she looked like an honorary man, the more she got punished, but then if she seemed feminine, she wasn't fit for the job, right? So we see these kinds of stories all over the world. We also know, I just have to share this with you because I think it's fun. In Sweden, there was actually research done on quotas, and they saw an improvement in competition that included an increase in the IQ of the legislators in the offices as a result of quotas. Right, so we know that quotas are actually making the system more competitive, not less. So the challenge that you're raising is how do feminists and how do people who support gender justice address these kinds of claims that she wasn't qualified? Because of course, men who are in positions of power are going to put women into positions who aren't going to threaten them or might not even be able to do their jobs.
But it's interesting because I want to agree with everything that's being said, but sort of take a different lens on it too, because if you have a quota that's based on competition and a quota, then it shouldn't be somebody putting somebody into power. It should be somebody rising
like in the
up.
ministry, as she was talking about, right? Then that's an executive.
So because the way I think quotas work is if you think about either sort of from a hiring to recruitment and organizational change, is that you want to make sure that there's equal opportunities, right? So where the quotas have worked in both the public and the private sector, because Germany has quotas in the private sector. And how did they work? They didn't work by the quota alone. They worked by your performance bonus being tied to that. So there's got to be a sanction around it. Quotas worked in Norway and a lot of the Nordic countries, but it also worked because there was a trust in government, right? And so there is this need to break through the recruitment or the hiring and promotion things within both the public and private sector that will allow women that don't have the same networks, potentially don't have, and it's a lot of it's networking, but the same opportunities, the same access to present themselves, right? But it is important that you still have to deal with it. So Namibia has this zebra quota that's relatively new since 2014. They have a fantastic prime minister who is a minister of finance. But it's still interesting how that unconscious bias and cultural thing comes in. When the president's introducing her, and you can YouTube this, and he says, and I looked around and I found the most qualified, beautiful candidate that I could, kind of thing, right? And that's a cultural sort of the way we talk about things, right? But the quota is very important to getting those numbers, to getting the access to the competition, sort of raising that notion of meritocracy, and it doesn't always do that, right?
And
but you have to
what
have
a zebra
parties.
quota is.
Pardon?
Tell people what it is.
Yeah, so there can be a variety of quotas. So there are quotas in political parties that will say you have to have a certain percentage of the candidates that are in this party. There are other quotas, like in Uganda, there's a quota that says there's one seat for the man, there are women's seats in parliaments. There are other quotas that set a percentage, that we want a percentage of whatever body this is to be women. Right, and parties or the private sector will say, I won't interview any candidates unless you bring me a slate that is at least 50% women and qualified. And so I think when we look at quotas, you have to look at what the quota is exactly. You have to look at what the enforcement is, because if there is no enforcement, it's easy to come back and say we couldn't find those, or it's easy to present that slate and still take whomever you want off that slate, right? Or you put the women on the back of the ballot and the men on the front of the ballot. And so for those voters that don't actually take the time, they just tick the top boxes. But that's what quotas are. So there's different types of them. And I think what's important is what is the enforcement mechanisms? And then going back to something you said, in most cases, quotas are temporary, coupled with enforcement. Meant to get a certain amount of numbers in so that the networking, so that the exposure, so that the unconscious bias or the prejudice can start to break down. Prejudice starts to break down if you work with 75% of people that don't look like you. There's studies on this, that just being forced in it happened in the US military. And so just getting numbers at the table does help. It doesn't necessarily always solve the sort of who's at the table necessarily helping the rest of the women, as we were talking about earlier. But it does help in changing the notion of who's a good leader, what's qualified, and who should be at the table.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one more quick question, and then I'm gonna throw it open. So please, it's hard for me, by the way, to see over here. So if you're on this side of the room and want to ask a question, I would encourage you to come this way, because I'm not gonna see you because that light is very bright.
Really bright, yeah.
Or, jump up and down or something. Just giving you fair warning. So I was going to ask this a little later, but I want to ask it now because I feel like I want to get us from, we know there are barriers and the numbers are problematic, to where we want to be. So if we were back in the same room in 10 years, what would you hope we would be talking about? What would be different? And I'll start with you, Catherine.
I think in 10 years' time, I hope that we would be in this room and we would have really progressed on many of the discussions around around this topic. I said this earlier, but I would like to see that there are more men sitting here sharing the great stories of how they in their organizations, within their communities, within their countries are spearheading women equality programs, he for she campaigns on a local level or within a structure of their own corporate initiatives, etc. I really think that part of the solution has to be, or part of the solution to the challenge is making sure that many of the role players in that challenge, being men holding women back, need to be a part of that conversation. The other thing that we haven't mentioned that I do think is really important is women supporting other women. You don't see that enough. And I think that that's also a really big problem. So even within the space of political participation, active citizenry participation, and women leaders within communities, they all work in silos in the communities that I work in. And this is not true for, for the whole world, but the communities I've worked in, the countries I've worked in, unfortunately, women are sometimes women's greatest challenges. We don't always help to lift another woman up. And I think that this narrative also needs to change. And I hope in 10 years' time, we would be sitting in a room where women are there supporting other women. Programs such as many of the fellows that are here in this room, where they nurture a sense, at Presidential Precinct, we have a group of women where we're leaders from across the continent. We're able to lean on each other. Buki and Lulu, who are in the audience specifically, and our wonderful, wonderful panelists from earlier, the ladies from Rwanda, Uganda, all of our ladies are able to connect with each other and lean on each other. There is a strength in that, and we need to cultivate more engagements that are personal and allow us to actually be authentically true about the challenges that we really, really battle with the most, those that are not spoken about in forums like this. And I hope that in 10 years' time, we in our small communities have done that over the next decade in order to allow us to have richer conversations with men sitting on this panel.
And in 10 years, will you be in elected office?
Absolutely. I think I do believe in the country that I live in, unfortunately, we see a collapse of leadership. And that is why you see people being put into quota positions that shouldn't be there. It is a matter of feeding a broken leadership system. And so I believe that our political arena and our country as such needs good people to stand up and to do good. And in order to affect change, you need to be a part of those systems. So absolutely, in 10 years' time, I hope to be here and to not only be a member of parliament or a minister, but to be running for office.
Okay, great, very good.
Fabulous.
Denise.
Yeah, so I was actually going to build off what you're doing now, because the research tells us that that's the most important thing. So we discussed not all, of the barriers that women face when they move into participating in politics. And one of the things that we know is the most effective way to fight back against all of those barriers, the ones that we discussed and that we didn't get to, is to have women organize as women. So it's great to think about women's leadership, but what really matters is women in civil society. Women's movements are what change public policy. You need a few critical actors in that legislature, happy to have you there, right, who are feminists and who really care about the issues that so many women in the world face. But we need to focus not on the elite women in parliament, not elite white middle-class women like me in the United States. We need to focus on ordinary women who are fighting their everyday lives and battles. What can we do for them? And the answer is going to be women's movements in every institution, in the newsroom of the top media organizations, right? In political parties, in powerful trade union movements. In this university, I've founded women's caucuses. Wherever we can, we need to organize women and demand change and include allies, include feminists who are also going to be men. So that's what I'd like to be talking about in 10 years.
Okay.
To add to that, I'd like to arrive, I guess, in saying that we have progress. The first thing I'd love to be doing is talking about a panel in terms of political and policy leadership that talks about leadership, that talks about whether that's transformative leadership, what makes a good leader, that's not driven on a gender discussion, that's not male leadership versus female leadership, that's really driven on what is a good leader today, what is good governance today, what do those structures look like. I'd also like to see where we're able to say, stop looking at the barriers and start looking at the accelerators. Start looking at what has happened, and not just for, as you were saying, sort of upper middle class white elite women, but sort of all of the women and all of the men across the society. It's looking at how are we being equal opportunity for all to public office, for those who are qualified, for those who want, and to see, I guess, the positive things. I'm an optimist, right? So I'd love to be at the table 10 years from now saying, not what are the barriers, but what are the best practices? What have we done? Yeah. What are the great things that are happening to make good governance and to make great leaders? And men and women in all aspects of society, young and old, wherever I lie in between those things, right? I haven't quite accepted it yet. But to be able to talk about that and to be able to come and just talk about leadership and not have it be gendered and have it be inclusive and have it be diverse and have it be positive. Is that too much to ask for? No. Okay, good.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to all of you. Now, I think there's someone with a microphone around. Yes? Okay, if you have a question, raise your hand. Hopefully I'll see you. Okay, and please tell us your name and where you're from as well.
Hi, my name is Catherine Law, and I'm on faculty here at UVA. And Denise has touched a little bit on this, but I think in this time, in this place, it's becoming clear that gender violence, that harassment of women, that sexual exploitation of women has been a factor beyond anything even those of us in the field have really, truly understood. When powerful men in media are shaping the stories and keeping women out of roles in which they can shape the stories, when everything, entertainment, politics, and I'm feeling a little hopeless right now, because that seems almost so amorphous, it's hard to understand how to even get our arms around shaping that. I can't imagine the United States is unique in this, so it's a global problem. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that issue.
Okay, I'm going to take two questions and then kind of have us 2 or 3 questions at once, because I think that can sometimes make the conversation sort of flow a bit. So are there others with?
There's one on the side.
There's somebody here. I don't know where. I can't see a darn thing.
I know, it's really
so sorry.
Hi, my name is Disha. I'm from India. My question is regarding the quota and the research that you guys were sharing. In Indian Parliament, we have we call it reservation. In Indian Parliament, we have a reservation of 33% for female. And that has been implemented to local governance level as well. And interestingly, last year, in a lot of areas which I saw was that there will be female candidates who will be running for local government, local elections, but it would be their husbands or their fathers who would be going for meetings. It would be their husbands who would be going for campaigning. It would be their husbands' faces which would be posted on the posters on the walls of the villages all around, right? So when the reservation was implemented, it was a matter of celebration for the entire feminist community in India. But do you think that, that's a start, that's a funny start, but do you think that may lead us somewhere? Do you feel there is some hope in it, or it's just a futile exercise altogether, with this entire process of how it is being implemented?
Okay, and then let's take one more question. Again, I can't see anyone.
Way over there.
There's 2.
Can someone see someone? There's some back here as well. We'll come to you if we have time, hopefully.
Hi, my name is Christine Switzer, and I'm a UVA alum, and now working at Fidelity Charitable. And I often will meet with women, including myself, this has crossed my mind, who are interested in running for politics someday. But as you know, research shows in this country that the salary is just insufficient for many women to run, unless you're wealthy or married to money or whatever it may be. And if you're raising a family, it's even harder, and it's especially difficult for women of color who are making even less money than white women. So just curious what your recommendations are to solve this really important problem.
Oh my God. Okay, so we have, right, okay. We'll be here for the rest of the day now.
How do you want to begin with that one?
The rest of you panelists, too bad. No. So we have 3 questions. I'm going to say something about one of them, but I'll just sort of recap them for the panel and then ask each panelist who'd like to respond to either 1 or 3, any of them quickly, of course, because we'd like to get over here. We have one about violence against women that's pervasive in the political sphere in general. One about quotas, and issues with implementation of quotas, particularly in India, and one about sort of the economic imperatives that make it difficult and disincentives for anyone except for a certain group of people to really be able to run for office in an economically sustainable way. The one thing I want to say about the issue of violence against women in politics, I don't know if Sandra is here yet from NDI, but
She's right over there.
Okay. Sandra and the National Democratic Institute, Sandra Pepera, they've done a lot of work now on an initiative called Not the Cost, which has to do with how to decrease violence against women in politics that dissuades women from running. So I think if those of you who are really interested in that topic, please make sure to talk to Sandra. She is moderating the panel, 2 panels from now.
Yeah.
And so she'll be around, I assume, but just so we know, we have a great resource in the room and an expert in the room on that particular issue. And I'll throw this over to you all on these 3 questions. Denise, why don't we start with you? So you're in the middle, we never start with you.
Okay, sure. So actually, I see these questions as somewhat connected. So one of the things I can say that's hopeful, Catherine, is actually we see a lot of media, we see a lot of attention put on violence against women in various spheres, but the research overwhelmingly shows us that what's most ubiquitous is this kind of marginalizing, or what some people call cultural imperialism, right? So that kind of mansplaining, the silencing of women, the not refusing to call on them when they raise their hands to speak. That's what's most ubiquitous. And what gets a lot of the media attention, because it's physical, it's visible, is this kind of violence that you're thinking of, right? Not to say that it doesn't happen, it does. And it does dissuade women from participating in politics. But the other stuff is what all women are experiencing. And I think that's part of the Me Too campaign, right? That we have this broad definition in the United States of sexual harassment. And my guess is there isn't a woman on the planet who hasn't experienced some of that, what fits in the definition of sexual harassment. And so thinking about it in a broader way like that, right? And being able to identify that, yes, this happens to me, and then talking about it, even though it's depressing to see that it's out there, I think is actually, for me, it's been really encouraging. I'm tired of the silence. I'm sure you are too. We're all tired of the silence and all of the ways in which each one of us, by being silent in some ways, and for some of us it's certainly more costly than others, has in some ways contributed to this kind of a problem. So for me, this has been incredibly hopeful, although I know for many people it can be re-traumatizing, and there's going to be a lot of denial, and we're always going to face backlash. That's just part of the way that this works. We can't really avoid it. So it's about organizing women, again, to come together and figure out what is the narrative. How are we going to shift this from a story about Me Too as a victim to instead him too as a perpetrator, and then how do we as a society try to stop this? And I think that's what we're starting to see, is actually a shift away from women as victims and liars, and men actually admitting that, yes, I've done this and it's wrong and we need to change. So for me, anyway, that's been really exciting. And this notion of, how do we get more women into politics? And once we get women in, are they just tokens? Or, they're not even tokens. We need a special word for what you've described, I think. And one of the reasons that they don't get involved, that you didn't mention in the back, but we can also think about in terms of structural barriers, right, that exist to preventing women from entering politics, which caretaking, right, the sexual division of labor is one of those structural barriers. So the violence against women is another one, right? So these are all connected, unfortunately. So actually addressing one in the media helps women in other institutions and in other spheres, like in politics, begin to address this. The money question actually affects men in this country too. I think that most of us would agree that money plays much too large a role in politics in the United States today. It affects women more, it affects black women more, simply because we don't all get paid the same, right? But it affects our democracy. So this is a horrible issue. And the narrative then, it seems to me, for women is to say, this affects me, but this affects our democracy, right? And hook into something that people really care about and make it a women's issue, but also build those coalitions that we're seeing to form now across groups who are interested and invested in social justice. And this connects to India, right? Men are heads of family. Kinship is how you move forward in a rural society in India, which is where I think you're primarily talking about, right? So the only way to get votes and to think that you're ever going to exercise power is to be the head of a household. And heads of household are automatically understood to be men. So again, thinking about the sexual division of labor and the ways that that create structural barriers that then get multiplied in various institutions, and we see it playing out in this particular type of election. Do I think quotas still matter? Yes, I think they matter, because look at what we're talking about. We're actually talking about the problem, and you can, excuse me, you can give specific examples of how this is a farce. So what do we have to do? Or in India, what has to be done in order to make sure that women not only have access to power, right, but they have the voice, they have the capacity to actually speak, right, and be heard and challenge the rules of the game. And that's a much deeper way of measuring things than numbers, and much more challenging. Excuse me.
Catherine?
Just to touch on one or two things. Unfortunately, sexual violence in South Africa is a huge, huge problem. In South Africa this week, in fact, we start a campaign that happens every year. It's called 16 Days of
Activism
against violence, and we really drive home this discussion around sexual violence. In South Africa, somebody is raped every 4 minutes in our country. The horrifying thing is those are the ones we know of. Those are the ones that are reported. It goes back to something I said earlier, and it touches on many of the things that have been asked. It really is about the value set we hold true in a society and as a nation. What are the things that we want to be known for? What are the values that we share in our home? Because those morals and those values would talk to us about allowing conversations around things that are really taboo, because culturally we don't talk about rape, we don't talk about sexual violence. If it happens, you don't talk about it. If in your home with your spouse, your husband or wife, because husbands are also abused, if that happens, we don't talk about it. So it's readdressing the narrative of how we actually address these systemic issues that are actually destroying our communities. And sexual violence and rape at a very community level is a huge issue that we face. So it's not even, within the workplace, just within the home. And most of the sexual violence happens by somebody that you know. The perpetrator is unfortunately often somebody that you know, and horrifyingly, possibly somebody that you're related to. And so this is a big problem that we're trying to address, because it opens up an opportunity to allow women to participate in community engagement once they have sort of let go of the stigma that is attached to them, that they have inflicted upon themselves, the stigma, or the society has inflicted on them because of the taboo of not speaking about sexual violence. And then with regards to the question on taking public office, well, I must be honest, I don't think you take public office to make money. And I think that the important thing is that you need to drive what your purpose and your passion is. And once you drive that purpose and passion, you will find that you connect and you fit in, and you're able to drive policy change, and you're able to be a driver within that space to make sure that you're part of changing that system, that policy, and making sure that women are able to be single moms and politicians at the same time. Because this is not a normal narrative. This is not traditionally what men have had to deal with. So how do we make sure that we're part of that discussion, we're around that table, and we're there to change that narrative? It's really important that we step up to the table and step up to the plate and make sure that we are engaging on those topics that people don't even think of. People don't even think about how does somebody in public office actually manage to have 2 or 3 children, and this is the case with many of our female politicians in South Africa, as single moms who work late hours, who have to drive very far, have to make sure that they're able to put their children into school, somebody driving them up and down, because your role and participation, you're stepping up to be part of building your community or your country. So you have to make sure that that is what your drive and passion is. And hopefully, we pray to God that the money will eventually follow and that you can pay the bills. But I don't think that that's something that we don't get into it to make money. Unfortunately, I think in Africa, we see too many politicians. People say they're businessmen because they know exactly how to do it. They're making lots of money. But that's not at the service of the people. That's at the service of self. And I think when you're in public office, service of the people must be your core value, because that is how we will drive change.
And Gwen.
Yeah, I don't want to speak too long because I think we covered a lot of it, but I think the hope that I have that ties to sort of the harassment and the quota is that we have to be able to talk about it. You have to be able to talk about it in the home. You have to be able to talk about it in the public setting. You have to be able to talk about it and sort of to overcome it. Whether that's domestic violence in the household or violence in the society. And I'm hoping that that we can normalize that discussion. But also, as Denise said, that we separate out sort of what the media is saying, what's going on in the classroom and what's going on in the home. And as you know, I mean, I lived in various countries in Africa for 20 years, including Mozambique. And it starts in the home. It starts with how you talk to your kids. It starts with what the father says to both the daughter and son.
Yeah.
It starts with who eats first. And it starts, what do you talk about? What do you say? And normalizing that conversation, whether it's quotas or violence, so that you can find those solutions, right? So that you can find the reason for everybody to be at the table, so that you can overcome and figure out how to reduce those levels of violence, because some of that is driven, and a lot of it is by this unconscious bias, cultural practices that people hold, right? That's where a lot of this comes from, whether it's the physical and emotional violence or it's the mansplaining, right? Sort of wherever it comes. But I'm hoping that by all of us standing up and saying, we have seen it to varying degrees, we can talk about it and we can figure out how to get past it. We can see what quotas work. We can look at, there are qualified when we can see them, we can touch, we hear them on stage, and we can go, well, that was a useful tool to get us there. Yeah. And then just to final on the cost thing, I completely agree with you. I think sort of the salary of public office in a way is sort of like the salary of the teacher argument. But I'm completely with Stephenie on the sort of cost of running for office, because there are solutions and ways to do that, and looking at models of countries of how much it can actually cost to run your campaign. I think we're sitting in a country that has probably sort of the highest cost. But a lot of times you can't even run in Africa, for example, in various countries in Africa, if you don't have family members, or you don't have a certain level of income, right? Or you're not married to the current president. But I'll leave that controversial statement out there.
All right, I think we've unfortunately, come to the end of our time. But I want to first of all, I want to thank our panelists. But before we do that, I want to just take sort of the privilege of the moderator to say, I find this conversation incredibly hopeful. I have had the privilege in my life of working for a phenomenal woman elected official, Senator Barbara Mikulski, and one of my colleagues who also worked for Senator Mikulski is here, Shannon Kula, we were both her chief of staff, and we saw, I think, how women in elected office make a difference in terms of policy, in terms of promoting women to be leaders themselves. Shannon and I were talking because this morning, the Women's Caucus that Senator Capito talked about of the women senators, Senator Mikulski helped start that, and she also was instrumental in helping found, along with Olympia Snow and others, the Women's Health Office at the National Institute of Health. So just in one person's life, I've seen one person who's forceful. She's not a wallflower, but really make a difference. And I think the more talent like that we can unleash in the world, whether it's women, men from different age groups, different ethnic groups, I think we will be stronger. And this conversation makes me more hopeful that we do that, because the more we talk about the issues, the more we have experts like this just really honing in on the conversation, not agreeing with each other all the time, but like helping us all be better at how we make arguments and think about this issue. I think we will see progress in 10 years. So I hope to be back here in 10 years, not having a conversation maybe about gender, but about the impact that a woman president in the United States will have had, or a woman head of the UN, or some really phenomenal breakthrough that I think will also help us sort of push this progress forward. So I want to thank our panel. I want to thank you all for coming. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer more questions, but I'm glad that we were able to start this conversation, and I hope that we all continue it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephenie.